This is the first time I'm doing this particular presentation on a Windows machine, but I think it looks fine. I always think that the Windows emojis are kind of cute because it's a very different style. It's very flat, and so this is a no slide talk. Essentially everything you see here, as you can see, I'm running it on Firefox at the moment. And so with Firefox, you can do like some cool stuff. A friend of mine named Alex Lakato, told me that, you can actually style stuff in the console log. So the title of the talk is, Demystify, CSS, blah, blah, blah. It's a DevTools talk. Let's just be honest. So once of all, thank you everyone for joining this meetup today. So let's get started. So like you can see, all the tabs are already open. So each page is gonna cover I would say like a topic that I want to talk about. And so the first, to kick things off, I want to talk about something called content-based sizing. Because I recently had a conversation with a designer at work, and they were kind of just interested in how I like to work with designers. And one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, like, I worked for an advertising agency. I think it's coming up to maybe six years ago. And I don't know if how many of you can remember how front-end web development or CSS was like 6 years ago, but there were so many things that we couldn't do. Like, I remember saying no more than yes to a lot of the designs that they gave me. So my point to him was that I would hope that designers who work with me will don't take the no's that I tell them today as permanent. So I'm like, I'll tell you no today, but don't stop asking, because who knows, 2 weeks later, the browser might have updated itself and then it works. But anyways, content-based sizing, I think it's a reasonably new concept that I hope picks up steam and becomes the norm. Because the concept of automatic sizing, that is not new, because browsers have always managed to figure out like how much space content should take up without us having to do anything. It just flows, right? There was this joke site that said that the web was responsive by default until we broke it. I was like, that's actually very true. But what we have in a newer spec called the CSS intrinsic and extrinsic sizing module, level 3, for those of you who are interested in specs, is authors like you and I, we now have the option of assigning automatic widths to elements on the page. What does this mean? This means that the width and height values that we're very familiar with, the width and height properties, sorry, that we are familiar with, can take 3 additional keyword values. These 3 keywords are min content, max content, and fit content. So min content, the first part of this page, min content is the smallest size that a box can take that doesn't lead to overflow. So if you have any inline content, it will break into multiple lines. The example being this one, you can see it's a sentence, but it's an English sentence, and the width of this box here is actually the width of the longest I call it an unbreakable entity, because it's content plus the full stop at the end. So the browser's not going to break the full stop by itself. It's not how. I feel like there's a lot of intelligence in browsers that we just like take for granted. And it becomes even more evident when we deal with different languages, right? So anyway, browsers don't break words by default. So for English content, this is, like I said, a single unbreakable entity. But for languages like East Asian languages that use Han characters, Chinese, Japanese, for example, and the break is actually per character. So if I have assigned, like, all 3 of these boxes have min content assigned to the width. Let me highlight since the break DevTools is open. So I've assigned min content. Min content as a width is supported in Firefox. I think Chrome does that. It's okay on Chrome as well. So it's not, let me think. I guess IE11 it's not going to be there, but I think it's been out for a while as a width value. So even if you do this on Chrome, it'll look like this. But the point is, for Chinese, the line breaks are per character, but not all the time. What do I mean? This is because Chinese is the characters, they're called square characters. So if I add a punctuation, like a comma, Chinese punctuation is kind of fun because the punctuation in a Latin-based language is like the width of the punctuation. For Han characters, we use full width punctuation. So if I highlight, you can actually see that the punctuation itself takes up the width of the entire square. So it's like a square character-based language, which lines up really nicely into neat rows and columns. So once I add this punctuation in, again, the browser's not going to break the punctuation, so my width of my box for min width now becomes 2 character spaces. And then we also have some other East Asian languages like Thai. So Thai, this is a sentence in Thai. Thai is very interesting because they're written without spaces between words. So if I call your attention to the second bit of content, these are same words, right? Same words, but sized differently. In a situation where there's lots of space, what max content does is that it's going to try to size the box. It's going to give the box as much space to lay itself out on one line without breaking. That's max content. So for the Thai sentence, there are no spaces. That's how the Thai script is written. So I personally don't speak Thai. I don't know if anyone in this meetup does speak Thai, but we wouldn't know where the line break is, where the word starts or begins, but the browser does. And so the browser breaks it at the word, again, with the longest length, which is this one. It's pronounced prayok, I think. But I found that a really interesting aspect and it highlights the point that sometimes there are a lot of things that we can actually allow the browser to do instead of like forcing, like giving a very fixed definition of how we want our things to be laid out, because there's a lot of things that the browser can do much better than us, one of them being max. And I'll probably cover a few of these like mathematical examples later. There's one more keyword called fit content. Unfortunately, as a width value, it's not supported. So if you can see here, it should show you that like, oh, hey, Firefox tells you invalid property value. That's okay, because fit content is fully supported in a grid context. So these examples, we're going to use grid to show this example. So let me highlight this. So you can all see that I sized it. The first column is a min content size. Second one is a max content size, while the third one is a fit content size. Now, fit content is not a fixed value like the first 2 keywords. It's a range value. And I find range values a really great addition to CSS. We've never had range values before. So we didn't have the type of flexibility that a range width value now presents to us, right? So fit content is a range between the minimum content size and the maximum content size, or the length percentage that's defined in this function. So it's really terrible to try to describe this with words. So let's do an example, and hopefully this makes sense. And so let's highlight this. So like I said, this third column here, it is sized to fit content. So when I highlight it, I can't zoom, so I hope everyone can see that the width of the third box is actually 300. So now there's a lot of space. The maximum size that the third column is going to go is 300, because that is the quote-unquote cap value that I've placed in the function. So it will shrink. If there's not enough space, it will shrink. And the minimum width it will go is the min content value. So you can see it's exactly the same width as min content. It will grow, but it will not grow to a max content value. It stops at 300 because I said that the maximum value it can go is 300. Now, if I change this cap value to something that is wider than max content. So let's check what the max content is. When I highlight, okay, it's about 482 pixels. So I'm just going to toss in a value. I'm going to toss in a value that's bigger than that. I'm going to call 500 pixels, right? Oh, don't type in Chinese. So when I do that, you notice that the box doesn't actually expand till 500. It's still capped at the max content width. So that's what fit content does. It will, the maximum width that you're trying to size to will be either the value you put in the function or the max content width, whichever is smaller. So that's how it works. If it doesn't make sense, what I highly suggest is just creating a simplified test case, something like this, no other styles, just sizing, and then just keep resizing the browser until it makes sense, because that's pretty much how I learned. But it's okay, let's move on. Let's move on to the second topic of the night, which is Flexbox. This is a joke that I made. Some people found it funny, but like, I think it's kind of true, because like, when I first started to use Flexbox without understanding how Flexbox, I was like, I don't know what the size of my things are. I just put in values and hope for the best. But over time, I kind of realized there was few key things that helped me to understand it. And DevTools is definitely a big help. As of right now, even as of right now, I think Firefox is still the only DevTools that does have a Flexbox inspector tool, which is really helpful. Flexbox is, I would say Flexbox is the first layout model that was designed specifically for a medium like the web, a medium whereby we don't, like we as the developers or designers, we can't actually control how our audience views the content, right? So like right now I'm presenting to you on this like a 27-inch desktop monitor. Some people could be reading their websites off their phone, so that's really narrow. I don't know, for some reason, some people would be like browsing on their smart TV. We can't control the size. We can't control where these people are reading your content. It's really up to us to sort of try to just make sure that our content doesn't break very badly. So I think a lot of web designers, we need to start throwing away the mindset that websites need to look exactly the same in every browser or something like that, because that's actually not that's not a realistic goal. I feel that a more realistic goal is to try to present your content in as consumable a manner as possible, regardless of how and where your users are going to consume it. So anyways, I think what Flexbox is interesting is that it allows the browser to take over sizing based on the amount of available space, which is again a very different mental model, because we're so used to like determining the size of our items. We don't think about the space around our items. But what Flexbox does is actually it gives us these properties, right? This ability to actually control to some extent the free space around the item. So this is a new mental model that I think it can be confusing at first, because the end result of like the size of your items may not necessarily be the value that you punch in. So first of all, I want to show you how the Flexbox inspector works. So if you have DevTools open, let me highlight this. You should be able to see if you have a Flex container. Firefox will show you this like two squares together, and then when you click it, it toggles the inspector. So you should see an overlay. I think the default color is purple, which is great. Purple's kind of a nice color. So what it does is it will show you, of course, the size of your items, and then the free space is represented by this like texture patterny thing. So you can see like the size of the Flexbox container is actually the entire width, but there is a significant amount of free space. that we can choose to leave it alone, or we can actually control how we want our items to be arranged together with this free space. So what the Flexbox inspector does is, I'm gonna like move this. So if you go to the layout tab in the Firefox DevTools, there is a section for Flex, a section for grid, and the traditional box model. I think this one we're fairly familiar with. So we'll see the grid one later. It also kindly tells you like, sorry, CSS grid not used on this page. Ding, 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 designed for empty states. Anyways, for the Flex container, you can also toggle it with this nice little blue toggle button. And it tells you what, more important, it tells you some pertinent information about your Flex container. So it tells you the Flex direction. So I didn't do anything other than the default. So the default is row. It also tells you the wrap status. So I didn't do anything, again, I didn't do anything special. So it's no wrap by default. I think the most important thing, what Flex DevTools tells you, is what it does to your item. So that like because I didn't set any values on the Flex items. So if I'm gonna highlight this, all I have is a margin on, there are no Flex related properties. So whatever is set on these Flex items is the browser default values, right? So this is a Flex container. All I did is do Flex. So for the default initial values, Flex initial, the Flex grow value is 0, the Flex shrink value is 1, and the Flex basis is auto. And I'm gonna explain this a bit more later, but this is just to inform those who are not familiar with the initial values. This is what the initial values are. Flex itself, the Flex as a property is actually a shorthand, right? So it represents these three different values. So if you don't do anything, it doesn't wrap by default. If you want your items to keep their original size, you would have to set a Flex. So Flex wrap, sorry. So that means when the length of your container X is not big enough to contain the cumulative widths of your items, it'll just wrap down, wrap down, wrap down. But if you don't, if you set a new wrap, a no wrap, the browser's just gonna shrink your stuff, man. So you're like, hey, what's going on? Why is there no wrap? Maybe check the wrap status, for example. So to further explain what's going on, let's go on to the second example. It's kind of tricky because y'all don't see that I see the Zoom faces, but I shift it around and you'll just think like, why are you clicking mid-air? But anyway, this is fun. So anyways, what I want to explain about Flexbox basics is that the sizing of Flex items does depend on a number of factors. So I covered like free space available, that will affect the size of your item. The amount of content inside the Flex item actually does affect as well. And there's also the starting width of your Flex item. So this interplay between all these different factors is going to result in what you see as your end size. So if you look at this second example that I'm highlighting, these are just words. But at this point, you can already see, right? Even though I've set the exact same values, so both of them, they have the class Flex basis, basic, sorry, which means that it just has a display Flex and nothing else, right? The items are not, there are no Flex properties on them, but they are different sizes. The first two columns have exactly the same content. Why are they sized differently? That's because the amount of content in the adjacent items will affect the size of the item itself. So this is something that I think we need to start getting used to when we're using Flexbox, so it doesn't come across as so confusing. So the exact algorithm that the browser uses to calculate the widths is actually stated out in the spec. For those of you who are really interested in digging out like exactly, I want to know the numbers, you could go into the spec, you could dig around, or you could just ask the browser to do the maths for you. Ding, ding, ding. So I found that the key to understanding Flexbox a bit better is really understanding the third value in the shorthand, which is Flex basis. And so Flex basis controls the starting width of the item. So I keep saying the word starting because that's very important. The starting width of something may not necessarily be the end width. Because if you think about it, what Flexbox does is that it allows, depending on whether you allow it to grow or shrink or not, the size is gonna, how the browser allocates additional space or deals with the lack of space is going to be different, right? So it's very possible that you could set exactly the same flex values on two containers, and then you end up having very different visual results. So this, by default, I mentioned that flex basis is auto. So I'm gonna highlight, let's highlight this one because it has a lot of content. So when there's a lot of space, it's not gonna expand because the default value for grow is 0. So when you set either the grow or the shrink to 0, that the browser is not gonna expand or contract your item. So grow is 0 by default, but shrink is 1. So when there is not enough space, by default, it will shrink unless you specify otherwise. So when there's lots of space, all this empty space is gonna be kept. The moment there isn't enough space here, yeah. So it starts to shrink. So this really, really, really long sentence is gonna start to shrink because there's not enough space for it. So by this point, you can see why the second column is sized differently already, because all the other items have to shrink together to be able to, you know, still be contained within the flex container. Now I put in Word as the first piece of content because in the previous page I explained that browsers are smart enough not to break. They're not going to break the word word into like W-O-R-D because it doesn't make sense. So this is the reason why setting the same flex values yields different results. But for the most part, flex basis is going to be the max content width. So this is like the max content width. When there isn't enough space, sure, it will shrink. So what we can do now is, let's say we have an explicit width set on the item. So I'm going to set the width of 200. So when I set an explicit width on the item, the browser uses the starting point as 200. So you can see from the DevTools that the browser is going to tell you, like, okay, I'm using a base size of 200 to start calculating. And then the final, okay, it's 198 because, well, I didn't do the border box thing, but the browser's really good at math, so trust it. So when you have an explicit width, that becomes the starting point for the browser to do its flex item size calculations. But flex basis trumps width. What do I mean? So if I say the flex basis to be 300, 200 goes out the window, and the starting width becomes 300. So even though the width, the browser knows, the browser even tells you, like, I know the width is 200, but the base size is still 300 because that's the flex basis that is set on this particular item. So that's pretty much how flex basis will impact the size of your item. And I haven't even touched on changing the values of grow and shrink yet, because you can also affect how the proportion of growth, right, for each item. So now that I mentioned this, we can look at the third example. So let's look at the code for this. The first one, so I wanted to make a distinction, explain the distinction between having a flex basis of auto, which is the content size, and the flex basis of 0. Because you end up with, again, very different results. Let's look at each of the things, right? So for the first one, flex is auto. So when we set flex to auto, Flexbox has a number of keyword values, and they are as follows. So initial is 0, 1 in auto. If you do none, then it's not flexible. So it just no grow, no shrink. That's that. What auto does is that you can grow and you can shrink, and your basis is still your content. And if you do a positive number, any positive number, that positive number defaults to the grow value. And the other two values are set to 1 for shrink and 0 for basis. So that's the sort of like preset keyword values for Flex. So what I've used for this is auto, so because I want the grow value to be 1 and shrink as per normal. The second one, I wanted double the grow value. So I set it to 2, the rest being the same. For the last one, I'm just setting it to like no growth. So the original was 0, 1 in auto. So the only difference between all three items is the amount of growth. So if we look at what the inspector tells us for, let's refresh this, go back to the original. If we look at this, right, the starting value is the content size. And the content for this is about 235 because there is space. So I'm going to stretch this even more so the space becomes obvious. The amount of space is only distributed between the second and the first and the second, because like I said, this one, we've already set it to not grow, so that's moot. But if you look at the flexibility calculation, for the first one, it grows about 100 pixels. For the second one, it grows about 200 pixels. So the amount of growth is double because I set the flex grow property to be double of the first. But the end size, the final size calculation, takes into account the content size. So when we, like, you can see like visually, right? The first item and the second item, they are not like double. The second one is not double of the first because this is how the browser calculates the final end size. Now, if there is a scenario where you wanted the your items to be like double, like just perfect double of each other, that's where the flex content 0 comes in. Flex basis 0. Because when you set the flex basis to 0, you're telling the browser like just ignore the content size. So for these three values, you can see they're highlighted. The flex it's similar to the one on the top, except that basis has been set to 0. So this is a 110, this is a 210, and this is a 010. So basically, the browser's it's gonna shrink all the way to min content, and it's not gonna continue. So this is like all the content in the third column is just like the moot content. But if we analyze this, content size 0, so all the flexibility is given, all the free space is given to the item size, which is about 330. And if I highlight the second one, you'll notice that it's like double, exactly double, 669. So depending on the design that you're working on, or the use case that you want to cater for, this is something to keep in mind when you're using Flexbox to size your items. So that's that. What Flexbox and Grid introduce is box alignment properties. Now, box alignment properties written in they are planned for every layout model. It's just that because display block, I would say the older layout models, they didn't have this. So box alignment wasn't invented when the original layout models came up. So my understanding is that eventually they're gonna rework the spec to allow box alignment properties to work on the older layout models. And what this means in plain English just means that it will be much easier to vertically align stuff even if the display is blocked. Ding, ding, ding. But for now, we'll just have to settle with using Flexbox and Grid if we want to use box alignment properties. So let's go to this bit, this very generic example, toggle the flex. So like you can see, there's free space. So what I like about DevTools is autocomplete. So you can kind of like just not type anything. And then if you can't remember keywords, doesn't matter, just do what most people do. They're like, I don't know what the property does. I'm just gonna click around until I see the one that fits. But yeah, so what justify content does is it does allow you to adjust the alignment of the space for your Flex container, right? So that's justify content, and I tend to remember justify versus align, because when I think justify, I think like those WYSIWYG editors or Microsoft Word that I grew up with. I don't know what you grew up with. You have those 4 icons, right? That they say justify left, justify right, justify text, justify. So I associate justify with the direction that your letters, the direction that your words are running. So the direction that words run by default on the web, it's horizontal. So when I want to, I hope the camera can see like my arms are waving, but like when I want to adjust content like horizontally, I will think justify. Because there are only 2 options available, if this means justify, then this must mean align. Basically, that's how I remember. Now, the slightly tricky thing is that for Flex, and also Grid, you can actually change the direction. So let's mess things up. Let's say Flex direction, autocomplete, yay, column. And let's give it a height so that it works. So if I change the Flex direction to column, okay, this is too short. Let's go a bit longer. Now the flow, instead of like left to right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, top to bottom. So then it's like this way. I'm doing a lot of hand waving, so if you're not looking at my face, I'm sorry. So what happens is that once you flip the direction to column, again, justify still works, but it now goes along the vertical axis, because now that's the direction where the words are flowing. So if you happen to have a Flex direction of column, remember that the box alignment properties are also kind of like flipped over. So that's justify content. So this direction that the words are flowing, it's called the main axis, and the corresponding axis that is perpendicular to it is called the cross axis. Naming things is hard, my friends. So let's turn all this off. So if you look at my items, you notice that they're all the same height, but that's not what I intended. It's just that by default, if an item is laid out using Flexbox, the height of the item is set to stretch. It's set to stretch to the height of the tallest item in that row. That's a default behavior of and grid items. So if you want to see the original, I would say the original heights, you would set a self-alignment property. So again, so it's either align items or align self. So align items, when you set it on the container, it will set the self-alignment properties for all the items. So you can see that, let's just do center, right? So these are actually the original heights in my boxes, right? So this is what the align items property does. It allows you to align items along the cross-axis. We're used to start, center, and end. I discovered that there's this thing called baseline, which is fun because if you have, for some editorial reason, you have a layout where the different text across different items are sort of related, but they're like styled differently. You can actually set the baseline to align up, so that if you compare this to, let's do this. Yeah, between baseline and center, like center is like your words are like mountainous and jagged, and it's like not really very pleasant to read. Baseline just sets everyone to the same baseline. So if you had to read the words, I find this like a bit more pleasing. So that's what align items can do, and that's a particularly interesting value. One more thing we have with alignment is align content. So let's see if this still works. If I can remember how this example works. I'm gonna make this tall. And then let's do this. So if you have a case where the Flex container is so big that it's more than the height of your tallest items added together, you're gonna have this like weird white space things. Because if you look at, I've highlighted this, I think it's easier to understand with the Flexbox highlighter, that all this is just empty space. So if you don't want this sort of like a weird spacing thing, what you can do is you use the align content property to kind of like pack things together. So instead of the free space being distributed between the items in the rows, you can pack them up. Like you can pack them to the top, you can pack them to the center end, and sort of. So this is what I mean when I say that Flexbox, also box alignment specifically, lets us control free space. Because this is something that we never had before, right? We could only say, oh, margin or padding. The margins and paddings are applied on a container itself. You never really like control the free space to this level of granularity. So I always found this like pretty interesting. Okay, let's move on. I'm speaking very slowly. So grid, you can't talk about layout without grid. Grid, very fond of grid because it makes doing full page layouts so much more convenient and easy, in my opinion. So the basics of grid is not too hard to wrap your head around because there are a lot of properties associated with grid, understandably. All you need to know to get started is this 2, okay, 3 if you want to count display, right? All you need to do is define rows, define columns, put your stuff in it, call it a day. So I like the syntax for grid because it's sort of visual. If I say I see 3 values for column, I see 3 columns in my grid. If I see 2 values for rows, I see 2 rows. So this maps very nicely for my kind of brain. I understand that I have a very weird brain, so I don't know if this applies to everyone, but I personally quite like this. I also really enjoy using Flexbox's DevTools for grid because there's a lot of useful features. So as you can see now, now that I've activated grid, the grid section of the layout panel is highlighted, and they're like, oh yeah, no Flexbox at the moment, so let's shut that off. And so you can, because this is a page of grid examples, right? You can actually overlay multiple at the same time. So I thought that was really cool. Especially if you're working on multiple grids and across different sections, you can kind of visually see how they align. So I thought this was really helpful. You can even toggle, so you can turn off line numbers. I don't know why you would do that because I really rely on line numbers. Area names we'll talk about soon. You can also extend lines. So this is the part where I say that if you're using like different grids, but on the same page and you want to kind of get some alignment, you can actually extend the lines. And I think this really helps when you're designing. For the most part, I turn them off. So this is my default, my personal default, but you can really like customize how you want the overlays to look. So I really like that. You can change the color if you want. So that's the basics of grid. How you place items in the grid. We'll look at the second example. So I've got a I've got a grid that is ding 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 9 cell grid, but I only got 3 items, and so I can explicitly place these items using these values. So grid row, this one's better. Grid row and grid column. So it's kind of like the XY coordinates on a Cartesian plane, because when I define grid row 2, if you refer to the line numbers on the overlay, it's like, okay, so this is this center chess piece. I put grid row 2, grid column 2, and that's why it's smack in the middle of my pseudo chessboard. Yeah, the background is fake. Everybody, it is a linear gradient. It's not really there. But anyways, so this is how you place items on a grid. And what I find useful about having the line numbers, this is a simplified example. So for the most part, if you didn't have the line numbers, you probably know, you probably still know where to put, which number you wanted. But imagine if you had a larger layout or full page layout with like more complicated stuff, more columns, like 20 columns. You're not gonna sit there and count like, okay, 1, 2, 16, 24, and then place your item there, right? This is where I think the line numbers, you want to see the line numbers, and like, okay, I want it at 16, put 16, and I think that's where line numbers come in really handy as a tool. So that was a big plus for me. I think, yeah, Firefox DevTools had this like very, very early on, and this was really I think it was a big difference maker for me to actually start using grid, because I can't imagine using grid without all of these convenience features that DevTools provided. Next, interesting property from grid that I really like is the fact that we can name grid areas. This is fun. This is really fun. So now I've highlighted it. So this is what you can do. You can turn them off because they are admittedly a bit distracting. But if you turn it on, you'll see that, oh, hey, these were the word. I've clearly, not a very creative person, I've named the grid item containing an owl emoji, owl, and then mouse, and then flamingo respectively, because what is creativity? So what you do with the grid template areas is that, okay, so this is not a great example here because DevTools kind of smushes everything together. But if you're using a code editor, like the original code that I wrote for this, I use a monospace font. So you can kind of align everything together so it looks nicer. But for the most part, again, you define columns, you define rows. So this is a 6x6, right? So 6x6. What the grid template areas do, you have to have your columns and rows. You can't not have them, but you can do an additional grid template areas to name these areas. So how it works is that if you can see, I think I can zoom. Oh no, I can't, really? I can't zoom. Okay, yeah. So you notice that there are codes, right? So everything, each line that is enclosed by codes, that represents a row. And each value within the codes, each of these represent the columns. So that's how I've got like a 9-cell owl, a 4-cell mouse, and a 6-cell at the bottom flamingo. So what I find helpful about this particular property is that after I've named the areas, I can assign the items to the areas. So again, it's three items in a grid. I just call grid area owl, grid area mouse, and grid area flamingo. And I'm pretty much set. So for example, if I think that, okay, a mouse is very small, does not need 4 cells. I don't have to touch the code for mouse, right? So what I can do is I can just manipulate the size. Oh boy. I can just manipulate the size on the code for the grid container. So again, imagine if you had like a proper full layout that you have like, oh, I have a header, I have a sidebar, I have an aside, then I have a footer, and then I have content, and I have content inside the content, and I have content with cards, blah, 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 20 things. I don't think that because when you have this many things, it's inevitable that you'd have to rearrange them at some point. And if you want to cater for a relatively wide range of breakpoints, say maybe you have like 3-4 breakpoints to deal with, it's going to be a pain to go through to each item and like kind of reposition that. So what you could do instead with grid template areas is that you can kind of confine your grid, your layout code to just the container itself by kind of rejigging your layout based on these template areas. So that's something that I found really useful. So if you have to do that and you encounter this problem, you could consider trying it out if it works for you. Last example for grid is fairly new. I say fairly new, but it's been more than a year now. So this is no longer very new. This came out in Firefox 66. Today we're at like 70 something, but you can animate grid rows and columns. Okay, it sounds new, but it was written into the spec from day one. It's just that when you write things into the spec, there is a lag time before browsers implement it because everyone has priorities. Nobody's fault, nobody's fault. So 66 and Firefox shipped this. It was really new at the time. I think, I don't know if anyone has actually used this very often, but I didn't really understand how it worked. When I saw the initial examples that people shared, I was like, wait. It doesn't make sense. How do you make your item jump columns? That's a trick question, you can't. So it made a lot of sense once I saw how DevTools work. So if you look at this example, first assumption, like even if I didn't build this myself, I'm like, okay, it's 3 rows and 3 columns. No, it's not. It's a fake board. There's actually only just 2 rows and 2 columns. And what I'm actually animating is the size. I'm animating the size of the row and the size of the column. So if you look at the code, it is one grid container with one grid item, right? And what I've done is I have positioned my grid item to the bottom right corner of the first grid cell. And I am animating the size of the grid cells. So is the code, yeah, there you go. So it's a keyframe animation. So what I'm doing is I'm changing the size of the first cell. I'm gonna share this with everyone later if you really wanna dig into the code and see. But yeah, I thought this was really fun. I'm very sure that more creative people than myself can think of really more useful use cases than like animating a chess piece. This is kind of fun to know what it does. This is an example that I came up with where you could animate the shifting. So if I highlight this, this is an example where at a different breakpoint, I did adjust the grid template areas. And without the animation, it can be a bit jarring. So this has animation. I don't know how to turn it off, but can you imagine that from here to here, it's a jump. If you wanted to do this kind of animation thing, it's now possible. So it looks, I don't know, maybe it looks slicker. I don't know if this is a good practice or not. I just think it looks fun. So that's a possibility with animating grid rows and columns. So that's that. Oh yeah, one of the things that I get asked for quite a lot is grid or flex, right? And I always like to say that that's really not the right question to ask, because it's not an either or situation. It's a use case based situation. So this is an example I like to use to describe what I mean. If you look at this, let me highlight the grid. You'll notice that it is a design with a lot of empty space, and the items often don't take up all the space within the grid cell. So the thing about box alignment properties, and I mentioned this very briefly earlier, is that when you try to align self, the item takes up its origin, the item ends up being its original content height. So let's, I don't know if this is the right example. Wait, I gotta find one where I'm using, yeah. I'm gonna find one where I'm using both grid and flex. So the overall layout is done with grid, but like within the cell itself, right? I'm actually making it a flex container so that the item within it can be aligned nicely. If I did not do this, right? If I turned off the display, what's gonna happen when I try to align self instead, for example, is that the borders, which are part of the grid cell, are going to end up shrinking to the content width. And this is not the end result I want, because this is a design. It's a bit of a Bauhaus design, but it's filled with this thick black borders that outline each individual cell. So this doesn't work. This doesn't work. So in order for me to achieve this effect, I have to combine both grid and flex. And that's why I say that it's about what you're trying to build, right? It's not about which technique is better, because both have specific use cases. Now, I think the power of CSS, what is most interesting to me with CSS is how we combine them. Because individually, they're cool, right? Like color's a great property. But like when you combine all the different properties together, that's when CSS starts to get really interesting, right? Okay, this last bit is gonna be a bit confusing, and I might get it wrong because it's near midnight. But let's give it a try. Let's give it a try. Right? I call this flexible sizing, and this is a phenomenon that I observed when I was like resizing the browser. I mean, as a front-end developer, I do this action multiple times a day. I'm like thousands of times a day. I'm like, what do you mean you don't resize your browser 1,000 times a day? Come on. So let's go through these examples. This will be fun. So I talked about the different sizing properties. So what grid does, so all these examples are grid because right now grid has the best support for all these new sizing properties, right? So the FR property for grid, it's a distribution of free space. So when you have excess space, you can distribute it in a ratio form. So this first example, I just set it to 1 to 1, 2, 1. All the boxes have the same content. So the free space that's allocated in a ratio of 1 is to 2 is to 1. Great, very straightforward. Auto is similar in that if you have extra space, the space is going to be distributed fairly evenly. So this is almost the same effect as if I did 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. Now the difference is when you start to combine things together. So there's kind of like a hierarchy of how space is provided or given, taken away from items when you do a combination. So the third example is actually a combination of auto and FR. So FR will always get any free space first. But conversely, it's also the item that will get free space taken away when there's no space. So as you can see, when there's a lot of space, auto just gives the item a max content. That's the amount of space it gives you. Everything else goes to the green box. When there's not enough space, the green box shrinks first. So the auto boxes still hold their width. They will hold their width and they will keep holding their width because again, FR will continue shrinking. It's only when FR shrinks to min content that space starts to get taken away from the auto boxes. So that is a behavior that I found very interesting because this means that your items don't necessarily grow or shrink at the same rate. And I think that opens up possibilities. Now this second set is going to be even more interesting because it's an interplay between min-max and min-max auto and FR. So again, all three of them don't grow and shrink at the same rate. So let's see if I can get this right. If you look at example 5, I'm just going to turn this off. Yeah. If you look at example 5, it's FR, auto, and fit content. Let's do this. Yeah, then I can turn this off. So there's a legend right here, right? So green, blue, and orange, right? So I think we've established that green's going to get everything. And then when green runs out of space, when FR runs out of space, auto and fit content kind of behave very similarly. So they'll shrink together, hit. Everybody ends up at the same min content width, right? This doesn't change. But FR shrinks, I would say, at a faster rate. Shrinks and grows at a faster rate than blue and orange. Now, if we look at example 6, this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting because min-max has its own rate of change. So this is min-max, gold, yellow's min-max, auto, fit. Turn this. Shit, sorry, how long was I muted for? Anyway, I don't know what happened. I must have misclicked. But anyways, I'll just go from example 6. So auto gets
start with min-max. So
okay, didn't miss that much. Okay, got it. Zoom problems. So sorry. So when auto's gonna get like all the space first, because I didn't include FR. So if there's no FR, auto is the next. I would say next in line to get all the space. So auto gets all its space. Like when there's no space, auto will shrink first. That's fine. Auto will shrink until it reaches max content. Now this is the fun part. It's gonna stop shrinking. Who shrinks next? The min-max starts to shrink. So min-max, I've set this yellow box to be a range between 200 and 400. So once auto hits max content, it's gonna stop. And then min-max is gonna start shrinking. But before it finishes shrinking, you'll notice that auto and fit content will start to shrink. So this feels like an arbitrary point, but it's actually the point that allows all three of these items to hit their minimum widths at the same time. Boom. So the minimum width for the yellow box is actually 200. So example 6 ended up being min content at 200 at exactly the same time. So this is very, very interesting behavior that we've never had before. Let's see this with an actual example. So these two examples look very similar. Exactly the same content at a very wide width, they look the same. But I'm going to toggle off. So the first one is built with floats and percentages. So basically the traditional way, right? And percentages will grow and shrink at the same rate. So I'm going to turn off the bottom one. Oh no, wait, no. Yeah. So when I shrink to a very small width, it's going to start to look weird because the image is shrinking at the same rate as the text, but it's becoming too small too early. So if you look at the what did I even set for this? Okay, I did a 65% and a 55%, and I did some really icky overlap negative margin things to get that overlap over. But this doesn't look that great at a narrow width. So under, like, what we used to do is like, okay, I need to put in a breakpoint so that I can rejig the percentages. Now, if I turn this off and we look at the second example, basically what I've used here, how do I highlight this? Highlight. Okay, so this code looks a bit, so what I've tried to do is I've tried to use this variable width changing thing. And so I don't actually really have to add that additional media query. And it kind of still ends up being a reasonably decent looking design, even at a very narrow width without having to add an additional breakpoint. So I think this is a fairly good property that we can make use of, especially if you're doing editorial design things. And the thing about CSS is, like earlier I mentioned that it's a combination, you can combine grid and flex. So these are just layout related properties, but there's so many non-layout related properties that could work with the layout properties as well, because what grid introduces, the grid is a new way of laying out stuff. And what grid allows us to do is it lets us overlap things very easily as well. So if I highlight this, you'll see I'm doing overlap and I didn't have to do any weird negative margins. I just assigned my items to the appropriate coordinates, let's put it that way. So overlap is now easier. And if you have, so okay, this is a terrible example, but I just wanted to just throw in some mixed blend mode there, right? You can play around overlap with something like mixed blend mode, for example, for certain effects that would have been quite tricky to do properly without all these new properties. So what the point I'm actually trying to make now that I'm wrapping up is that CSS really is an evolving technology, so to speak, because none of this that I've showed you, I could do 3 years ago. I couldn't do any of this, most of this 3 years ago, right? So a lot of the older layout hacks that developers, like really smart developers developed, they still work. So it's not as if they no longer work, but they're no longer necessary. They're no longer as necessary. And these layout properties are specifically designed to suit a more dynamic nature now that we have more screen sizes than before, right? And so what I realized is that actually DevTools can be an avenue to encourage developers to start trying out the newer CSS properties, because for me, they really help me understand. Some of these new CSS layout properties required me to change my mental model because I was so used to the old way of doing things. But having like an overlay, like sort of having like graphs and numbers to show me what's actually happening really helped with my understanding. So I think if you never tried any of these out, I would suggest trying to let the DevTools help you in your journey. That's always a plus. So like things like the grid inspector, right, made it so much more easier for me to experiment with the complicated designs. So my point, I would like to encourage everyone to just give it a try. You don't have to do it in production if you don't want to. It's not that, I would say it's not that scary to start because there's a lot of support now, you know, with DevTools. So this talk I prepared for a conference, right? So the gag at the end of it is that I would time it such that I would say like, oh yeah, if you're really worried about like, just give the new CSS properties a try. It's not that hard. Yeah, so that was the gag. I thought I'd just include it here, but I haven't rehearsed it in a year, so I can't get the timing right. But I think this GIF was really cute. Like my best friend shared it with me, so like credits. Yeah, so that's pretty much the end of this talk. I ran terribly over time.